Okay, let's dive into this. We're looking at an article from The Economist. The title is Sending the National Guard to LA is Not About Stopping Rioting.
Hmm.
And our goal here in this deep dive is really to unpack the article's argument. Why does this source say the National Guard went to Los Angeles after those immigration raids and protests? What's the underlying story according to them?
Exactly. The Economist article, well, its core idea, its thesis, is that this deployment, it might not have been purely about restoring peace. It argues that, sending a political message was a big part of it.
Yeah.
And that's the angle we'll explore today, looking closely at what the source material says.
Okay, so let's set the scene based on the article. What kicked things off? Federal immigration agents, right? Raids across LA County. The source says they were targeting unauthorized migrants, arrested over 40 people. And it makes a point of noting about a third of county residents are immigrants themselves.
Right. And the immediate reaction, according to the article, protests. Crowds gathered south of LA and also downtown. The source gives details like, tear gas being used, flashbangs, and apparently some protesters threw rocks at the federal agents.
Which then leads the article to its main question, why bring in the troops? It mentions the move was ostensibly meant to restore peace. Ostensibly. So, that was the official reason given.
Yes, the stated purpose. But the article argues it was also a thinly veiled message.
Thinly veiled. Meaning the real reason wasn't exactly hidden. You could sort of see through it.
That's the implication in the article, yeah. That the political motive may be aimed at cities resisting federal immigration policy was pretty close to the surface, not subtle.
And the article contrasts that interpretation with how the federal administration was framing things, doesn't it?
It does, sharply. According to The Economist, the administration called the protests a violent insurrection. They even floated the idea of sending Marines. Their line, as reported, was that the raids targeted criminals and the protesters were radical leftists trying to obstruct justice. The article does mention an ICE data point, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, suggesting that about half the migrants arrested nationwide since October 1st did have prior criminal charges or convictions.
Okay, so that's the federal perspective presented. But the local officials, the article says, saw it very differently.
Very differently. The LA mayor condemned any rioting but explicitly supported peaceful protest. And California's governor, Gavin Newsom, is quoted saying there was no unmet need for federal troops. He called the deployment purposefully inflammatory.
Purposefully inflammatory. So the article's presenting his view that it was meant to stir things up, to increase tension, not calm it down.
Precisely. That's the interpretation highlighted. It underscores this friction between the federal government and the state and local authorities.
Right. And the article digs into the legal side of this, too. That seems pretty important to its argument.
It really does. It talks about the Insurrection Act, that very old 1807 law allowing the president to use the army inside the U.S. But crucially, the article states that act wasn't formally invoked here.
Oh. So they didn't use the Insurrection Act, even though they used the word insurrection?
Apparently not, according to the source. It says the president cited a different authority, basically framing the protests as a form of rebellion against the authority of the government.
Huh. Why does the article make a point of that distinction? What's the significance?
Well, the article seems to suggest it's significant because sending in federal troops, especially the National Guard under federal command, without the governor asking for them or agreeing, that's described as extremely rare. It also mentions the Posse Comitatus Act, the law that generally limits using the military for domestic law enforcement. So the troops' stated mission, the article notes, was narrow, just protecting federal property and personnel. Perhaps, the article implies, to navigate around Posse Comitatus rules.
And this rarity, the article compares it to something.
Yeah, it compares it to 1965, when federal troops were sent south during the Civil Rights Movement. A very different situation historically and politically. The article uses that comparison to emphasize how unusual this LA deployment was.
Okay, so the unusual legal approach, the rarity of doing it without state consent. The article uses these points to bolster its idea that maybe the motive wasn't just about handling protests on the ground, and it mentions things could escalate.
Absolutely. That tension between the feds and local officials is a big theme. How Angelenos themselves might react to troops they didn't ask for. And yes, the piece notes this kind of friction might not stay just in LA. It could potentially spread, especially, it suggests, to other cities with so-called sanctuary policies.
Right, sanctuary policies.
Right.
Just to clarify, based on the article, what does that generally refer to?
In this context, the source is talking about cities and localities that have policies limiting how much they cooperate with federal immigration enforcement actions. The article links the LA situation to wider administration criticism of places like Chicago, Boston, Denver, suggesting this is part of a broader pattern of tension.
Okay. So stepping back and looking at the picture painted by this Economist article, it frames the National Guard deployment in LA less as a straightforward response to disorder and more as, well, a politically charged action, one that created real friction between different government levels and maybe operated in a legally gray or at least unusual area.
That's a fair summary of the article's perspective, yes.
Yeah.
It really emphasizes the political context and the intergovernmental conflict. And that leads to a final thought, really, for you, the listener, to consider. Given these different viewpoints presented in the article, the administration's framing versus the local officials' reactions, how might underlying motivations, political or otherwise, shape how governments decide to use their power, especially during times of protests and social unrest? Something to think about.